Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Shane and I'm delighted to be joined by April Dunham, Partner Technical Architect at Microsoft USA, who will be talking to you today about Power Apps Makeover. Remember to join the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC21. Don't forget to check out the Resource Center. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com and click the content link at the top. ESPC21 will take place on the 1st and 2nd of June 2021. To be a part of this event, simply register today for free. We also just announced our keynotes. Full details are at sharepointeurope.com. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any question you have in the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter, April Dunham. Hello, April.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Super.
Right.
I can see your screen, April, so take it away.
Thank you. All right, so super happy to be here for Power Platform Week and happy and excited to talk to you all about making over your Power Apps. So a little bit about myself, for those of you who may not know me, my name is April Dunham. I actually did have a job change recently, so I'm starting as of last week. I'm a Power Platform Developer Advocate at Microsoft, so working to help all of the people developing on the Power Platform, getting you create content and make sure that their voices are being heard with product feedback. Before joining Microsoft, I've been here about a year and a half now. I was an MVP alumni and a Microsoft certified trainer. I'm also a blogger and a YouTuber. So if you want to check out my blog, that's sharepointsiren.com and just search for April Dunham on YouTube. And you should find my channel where I have a ton of different Power Platform, SharePoint and Teams related videos. So the agenda for today, I want to go over what makes an app beautiful. I'm going to give you a ton of different tips to make over your applications. We'll sprinkle in some demos of these tips. I'll point you to some resources, and of course, I'm going to leave plenty of time for Q&A, so make sure to use that chat, and any questions that you have along the way, please let me know. So setting the stage here, I really want to talk about the art of the possible. So how can you go from something like this? Now, I know we can't really do a show of hands here in the virtual space, but I'm sure all of us, especially when we first started out, have created a Power App that looks something like this. It's very basic, but functional. I want to show you and give you some tips of how we could go from something like this to something more like that, much more appealing and easy on the eyes. So to get started, what exactly makes a beautiful Power App? So really making over your Power Apps is as easy as pie. And what I mean by that, to make your Power Apps the best that they can be and make them beautiful, we want them to be performant, we want them to be intuitive, so easy to use, and we want them to be easy on the eyes. So really appealing, matching company brand standards and all of that. So if that kind of spells out pie, so just remember it's easy as pie, performant, intuitive, and easy on the eyes, and you will have a beautiful app and will be able to make over your Power Apps. All right, so I've kind of defined what I consider a beautiful app to be. Now, how do we get started? Now, the first step to anything before we even dive into the tips here is we need to understand our problem and our audience. So with any app you're developing, whether it's Power Apps or not, we need to start with why. So we want to clearly define the problem that we're trying to solve. Then we need to ask ourselves where. So if we know the problem we're trying to solve, where will people be using this application? Is it going to be inside or outside? If it's outside, you might need to consider some contrast issues and maybe a dark mode so that people in the high light can see it. Will this be in a Wi-Fi hotspot or maybe a service down that people will be using this in? If it's someone out in the field in the middle of nowhere wanting to log an inspection report, you might need to make sure that you have some offline mode capability and integrate it into your app. Next thing we want to do is ask how. how will people be accessing this? Will it mostly be on their PC or desktop, tablet, maybe their phone? We want to make sure that whichever aspect they're going to be accessing the app on, that we optimize our application for that. Also, are there any integrations needed? Maybe we need to be able to integrate this in SharePoint or Teams or some other application. We have to have that in mind. And then finally, who? So what's the geography? Do we need to accommodate for multiple languages possibly? And also we want to make sure from the get-go we're keeping accessibility in mind. So if anyone has vision impairments, hearing impairments, we want to make sure that we are optimizing our application with the appropriate labels and all the stuff that we need to accommodate for those situations from the start. Once you have that defined, we'll have a solid foundation and be well on your way to making over your applications. Next step is to get inspired. So really, design is kind of typically the hardest part in these things. You can kind of get your requirements, get the overall architecture of how your app needs to work, but making it look good can be a little bit hard, especially if you don't come from a design background like myself. I'm a developer by trade, so design doesn't always come naturally to me. So what I like to do is get inspired by things that are already out there. What are other people doing in their applications that I think look good? So a great way to do that is with some of the Power Apps templates that we already have out there. So there are a few good ones that I highlighted here. There's this crisis communication app that was released around November. Really good application there. So some design elements that they're good to see. There's return to work, customer success, asset checkout, and suggestion box, and then of course Dataverse for Teams. There's a lot of brand new, really good looking templates in Dataverse for Teams that you should check out for things like employee ideas and inspection reporting and all of that. Also, don't forget about the Power Users community. So if you go out to powerusers.microsoft.com, there are forums out there to not only get your questions answered, but people share Power Apps that they create in the community so that you can actually download those and see how people are designing their apps. There's also a Microsoft Employee Experience Starter Kit, which is what you're seeing here. So it's a collection of different applications for HR type scenarios. And then other websites I would suggest, UI Movement is a good one. So you don't want to limit yourself when you're getting inspiration to just Power App samples. Really, any mobile application or application out there, you can kind of mimic some of the styles and what they're doing there in your Power Apps app. I'm also a big fan of Pinterest. So there's Pinterest boards if you just do a search on there for app design that can help give you some ideas. And of course, hashtag Power Addicts on Twitter. A lot of us that are Power Addicts and use the Power Platform a lot will also share samples of our work on Twitter. Okay, so you got inspired, you have all your requirements. Now let's dive straight into the tips. First tip here, we're going to focus in this first section on the intuitiveness and making your app easy on the eyes piece of our pie there. Now, first thing I want you to do is to Marie Kondo your apps. And if you don't know who Marie Kondo is, she has a popular Netflix show where she talks about reducing clutter. So I kind of use that same concept when it comes to our applications because clutter is really the enemy of good design. I can't tell you how many applications I've seen that are just overloaded with way too much information and it's overwhelming to users and it just makes it look not that great. So I have a few clutter reducing app hacks that I want to share. And they're all kind of demonstrated here in the screenshot, as you can see. So tabs is a big one. So as you can see here at the bottom, we have a tab to move between different sections. So we have a few key things like activity, my kudos, and then a section for more. So rather than trying to show all of this information on one screen and have endless scrolling, you can break that apart using tabs to really make it look much better. Another big one is pop-out menus. Again, reducing the amount of information that shows at once, keeping it as clean as possible. So being able to say, click this give button and have it just pop up a screen to enter in that additional information. Also, more visuals and less text. So you can see this is a very visual app design here. So rather than, what type of CUDA was this, we're using icons instead. So this was a thumbs up, or this was a, compassion, advocate scenario, and we're using icons to kind of determine that. and also components for usability. And I'll touch more on that later on. We'll talk about what that means and what those are. All right, next thing. So I have a lot of acronyms for you. Hope you guys and gals and people there, everyone don't mind that. I remember your ABCs. So ABCs mean always be communicating. So we want to make sure that there's going to be scenarios where we might have long-running processes in our applications, which is sometimes unavoidable. So what we want to do is show just a simple loading message or some kind of information to the user that, hey, the app is working. It's just taking a little bit and it's loading your data. So we can use things like animated GIFs that you can download for free anywhere at the internet there and integrate those into our Power Apps so that we can have that nice visual. Also, success and error handling. So if someone did submit something and it worked, you don't want to just route them back to the home page and leave them wondering, well, did it actually submit? Just show a simple success message like you're seeing here so that they know whatever action they took worked. Same thing goes for errors. If something happens, don't leave them with some vague, confusing error. Make sure that you're utilizing error handling techniques and showing relevant messages to the user so they know there was an error and why there was and what action they need to take. The next tip I want to show you is all about the HTML control. So there's a lot that we can do in Power Apps as far as design. We have icons that we can utilize and different types of controls that we can use to make our apps look nice. But if we really want to take that to the next level and have more flexibility with the styling of our applications, we can leverage the HTML control in Power Apps for that. So what this is going to do is kind of allow you to do some things like we're seeing here. Notice how we have this little circle that's interactive where I can see how many PTO days I have. And then notice here in the individual breakout of the type of paid time off days we have, I have this nice kind of shadow effect and it's filling in this object. So that's called box shadows. So that's something that we can leverage with the HTML control. So all you have to do is know a little bit of HTML to add some additional styling so we can actually inject some CSS into here to get way more customability. And if you don't know HTML and CSS, a few links I do want to point you to. HTML Online is a good one. So it actually will let you have kind of a drag and drop editor where you can choose what you want something to look like, and it will produce the HTML for you. So all you have to do is copy what it produced and paste that into your HTML control in Power Apps. I also do have a video on my top 3 use cases for the HTML control where I do go into more detail on the things that you can do with this particular control. The next big one is SVGs. I'm a huge fan of SVGs, and really all they are is a fancy type of image file. So we can incorporate these into our Power Apps, leveraging that image control that we have in Power Apps. So we can do all sorts of things. Some of the things you're seeing here is we have a radio button, so or slider, we can drag and drop that slider and it's going to automatically fill in this donut chart, right? The other one we have is we can even do things as complex as maps. So we have a map that is an SVG file here. And each time we click on a location, it will actually highlight that in the map. Another great thing that we can do with SVGs. And again, there's lots of free resources. There's flaticon.com, which has a lot of SVGs that you can download and get started using in your applications. All right. Next tip, try galleries instead of dropdowns. So lots of times when you're building out some kind of application or a form, you might need to select from a list of information. So take the example I show here in an order form. We might select a product from a dropdown. Dropdowns are great for that, but one thing that you might consider is if you don't have a lot of items, perhaps use a gallery in Power Apps instead. And the reason being, from a design standpoint, we do want to reduce the amount of clicks that a user has to make. So consider a drop-down control. You have to first click the drop-down and then select the item from the drop-down that you want. So that's 2 clicks there that we have to make. If we leverage a gallery instead, so take the same product information of shirt, dress, skirt, and pants, store that in a gallery, all we have to do is one click. We just press the item we want, like a dress, that's highlighted, and that can be written to our data source. Now, this is only good for those scenarios where you have a limited number of items. So say maybe less than 10 items, this could be a good scenario for that. But something to consider because it's really going to help reduce clicks. All right, another tip here is smart inputs. Now this is really not a known function of Power Apps, but I wanted to make sure that I highlighted it here. There's a product or a function called virtual keyboard mode that we can specify here in our Power Apps applications. Now by default, this is set to auto. So sometimes that means it doesn't always work. So to describe this, here we have an order form. And in our form, we want to enter in the product, which should just be some text. So I might have like a widget or whatever it might be. And then we want the quantity. Well, a quantity is always going to be a number, right? It's going to be 1, 10, whatever it might be. Well, oftentimes, because this is set to auto, this virtual keyboard mode, that means if I have this pulled up on my mobile device, like I do, so see as I enter here, so I have product, it's text, it's fine, I have my text keyboard. I go to quantity, I want that to go straight to my number pad rather than the text keyboard. So that's something we can define with our virtual keyboard mode to force that to go to the number keypad rather than the text one, to just really make it easier for users to enter in that data. And I'll show you how to set that up here in a second. Another tip, responsive applications. So remember in that first step one where I asked you to get the requirements and make sure you understand who's going to be using it and on what device they're going to be using it, whether it's desktop, tablet, or phone. That comes into play here when we talk about the concept of responsive design. So kind of what you're seeing here, we have these custom layouts that we can use to make our apps responsive. And what I mean by responsive is no matter what device you're on, the app, as you can see here, as I scale down the browser, the functionality and the format of it is automatically moving with that. So I don't have to design two applications, like one for desktop and one for mobile. I can design one app, leverage these responsive layouts, and it will automatically resize and adjust accordingly. Okay, now at this point, I'm actually going to switch quickly to a demo because we just covered a lot, so I don't want to overload you with too much PowerPoint here before I go to demo. Now to show off some of these concepts here, first app I want to load is my desk reservation application. Now, this one is optimized for the mobile phone because most people will be accessing it there. And I'm using a lot of those concepts that we talked about. So as you can see, it's a very simple layout. Now, one thing that I didn't really mention as far as the design standpoint is to make sure that you're interjecting some kind of nice visuals into your app. So that's something you can see that I'm doing right here at the top. I just have an image of a computer and a desk since this is a desk reservation application. Also, I'm communicating to the user here that they are logged in as themselves. So I'm saying welcome back, and I'm dynamically pulling in the current logged in user's name. Below, you see I am using those tabs we talked about. So from here, this is where I would go if I wanted to see the dashboard, which I'm on now, see all of my appointments. So I click that, that takes me to another screen. And on this screen, you see I'm using tabs even further. So I'm a big fan of tabs because it really helps you have a clean UI. So I can filter here by upcoming, and notice that I'm specifying which tab I have selected with this underline, and then previous. So when I click previous, I can see all of the different reservations that I have booked so far. And then of course I can click book down here, and that will take me to another screen where I can reserve a desk. And you'll notice another concept I'm doing here to keep it clean is I'm leveraging kind of a multi-screen approach. So rather than have me select the date I want to and then the desk that I want to have at the same screen and all that, I'm breaking it out into different pieces. So I have a simple calendar control here that I can move from month to date here. I can select the date that I want to reserve the desk for, and this could be one date or it can be multiple. And then the time slot that I want to reserve it for. So maybe I need this one all day. So we'll say from 8 to 5. Now I'll guide the user with this design through the process. So I'll click continue. And now this is going to take me to another screen where I can select the type of desk that I want. So when I go there, and let's see, it'll take me to this screen so I can see all the desks that I have. Another thing that we're doing, I mentioned pop-ups before. So how do we integrate pop-ups into our app? And this is a perfect example. So I have a list of desks that I could choose from. What if I want to see where in the building that desk is located? So I have this little information icon. And when I click that, that's actually opening up a pop-up. This is an example of what that could look like. Notice I'm kind of graying out the background a bit, and I'm making this image of the office layout in the forefront, right? So I can see that this desk is right here, and then know that I want to choose that desk and move on to my next step and confirm. And the last thing that you'll see from the tips that I just showed you that I'm doing is I'm giving that confirmation message that my desk was reserved. And notice the other thing that just happened. It was pretty quick, but I got the confirmation message. I didn't click anything, but it routed me back to the homepage so that I could see all of my reservations. So how is that happening? That was a lot that I just showed, and let me break down some of this for you. Now, first thing for that success message, because this is really the easiest to accomplish. With Power Apps, our applications are broken out into screens. So every different action that we would be taking in the application, we can break that out into a screen. If I click on the left-hand side here, new screen, we have something called screen templates. One of the templates that we have available to us is the success template. So I can actually click that, and that will create a new screen with a simple label here to allow me to customize the success message, and an icon with a check mark, just a good visual indicator that whatever action that I had was successful. So all I have to do if I want to have a success screen is add one of those templates in here, customize my message, so I can just change the label there. And then I just have to tell it to go to that screen after my action was successful. So in that case, I would navigate to my success screen after I click the confirm button. So what we can do is click on confirm, and we can go to its on select property. And you'll see that I'm patching, which is just writing this data to my data source. And then after I'm done, I'm just using a function called navigate to take the user to that success screen. So pretty simple, but goes a long way to making your apps more intuitive and better to use for your users. Right, next thing I want to show is that pop-up, because these pop-up dialog boxes can be used in several instances. So I was showing it here to pull up a map. Another great use case for this is if I wanted to have a gallery of items and wanted to allow users to delete the items. Typically, you don't want to just let them click a button and instantly delete it. You might want to pop up like we see commonly to say, are you sure you want to delete this item, yes or no? That's something that we can leverage pop-ups for as well. So how do we do that? Now it's pretty simple. In here, I have a gallery, and that's where I'm surfacing up these desks. If I expand the gallery, you'll see that all I did was I added an icon into the gallery here for the little, and this icon, if you want to know what it is, you can go to Insert, Icons, and that's one of these built-in icons here, and there's one called Information. So that will show here, and you can select that information icon if you want to use that in one of your applications. It's that one right there. So all I did for the pop-up is on the click of this button in the on select, you see that I'm using an update context formula. What that does is allow me to define a variable to use in this application. So I'm defining a variable called showMap. And you see that I'm setting the value, so I'm going to separate that with a colon, and I'm setting it to, I have a exclamation point and then show map. What that little piece of code there is doing is it's saying show map is going to be a Boolean, so it's going to be a yes or no value. So whatever that value is, do the opposite of what it was. So if it was true, set it to false, and if it was false, set it back to true. So you can do that simply by putting an exclamation point in front of your variable name. Now that alone isn't doing much. Now, if we look here on the left-hand side in our tree view, and scroll up a bit, you see I have a group called group map. This is actually the pop-up information. So really all I did here to add this pop-up is on my screen, I went to insert and icons. And first I added a rectangle control because if you recall, let me just play this real quick. When I clicked on that, the background was shaded. So how I did that is I kind of just tricked it. I added a rectangle icon. So that's what this is right here. And I've set the color of it to this kind of opaque gray. So if I go to custom, you can define the opacity here so that you can kind of see through it. So that's all that I did. And I've added an image control to show my map. And I've added an icon so that when I click that icon, I can close out of the pop-up. And what I did is all three of these objects, I've grouped them. And to group an item, you can just click on the item in the tree view, hold down your shift key, and click the other item that you want to group, and then you'll see the three dots and you can select group to group those together. Now that I have that in a group, you'll notice that on this icon, I'm using that same function I had on the information icon. I'm saying update context, show map to the opposite. So that's going to set that back to false if it was true when I have it selected. Now pulling this all together, as you can imagine, now if I click on this group I created, and I click the drop down in the properties pane, there's a property called visible. So all I'm going to do is set the visible property to my variable show map. That way, that's going to be a true or a false. So as I click the information, it'll show, and as I click the X, it'll hide again. So this same concept you can use again for different scenarios like confirming delete, showing additional information, whatever it might be. Okay, so let me switch back to the slides real quick. So the next thing I want to talk about is something called components. So what a component does, it's really a reusable building block. So if there is something that you use time and time again in multiple different apps, or maybe just a single app but in multiple screens, like in the app I just showed, we had that footer on every single screen. Well, that was built using something called a component. And really all a component is, you can build it within your Power Apps application. You define a set of controls, and it just makes it as a reusable component that you can integrate into multiple screens so that you're not having to rebuild that item on every single screen or every app. So it's kind of like a parent-child relationship there. And the reason we want to use these, again, is because they're reusable, they offer consistency, they're going to give you better performance, which we'll touch on performance here in a little bit, and it's going to help you collaboratively develop. Now, when we build these components, we have different properties we can define. We can have input and output properties. So if we had a component where I wanted to, like that footer component that I talked about, where we had the dashboard, the My Appointments, and a new appointment, for that, we probably want to be able to specify what items do we want to show there to be able to navigate to. So we can do that with the input property of the component. Now, also the same context, we can have an output property. So if I need to be able to tell, well, which item did the person select in the gallery, we can define an output property for that. Okay, so to demonstrate that, let's go back to this same application and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So for all the apps that you have on the tree view, we should see an icon here, a tab for screens, and you'll see another tab for components. This is where you'll go to build these components that I talked about. So it's really as simple as how you would build out a screen in the Power App. You would say new component, and that would create a section here. So that's what I did with the tabs. All I did was add a gallery in here and a rectangle control to separate that. Now, in my gallery, I just have two things. I have a label and I have an icon. So I'm able to specify the item that I want to navigate to and associate that with a label. Now, the magic of this component happens here. If I click on the component and look on the right-hand side, I defined two properties. So those custom properties, if we click new, here's the types I was talking about. We have input and we have output. So if I want to put something into the component, I would choose input. If I want to get something out, I would choose output. So if I look, I have one property called table. Oh, sorry, called items that is a table. So this particular property is an input. So what I want to have happen here is I want to be able to let the user, when they add this component onto the screen, choose what items to show here. So that's why I've defined an items input property and have the data type as table. And then I have one more called homepage, which is a input property again for the screen. So how this plays together is if I look here on my component and click on the dropdown, you see that I have this property. So here's my items property. And you can tell that I'm formatting a table where I have the name of the screen, the icon, and the page I want to navigate to. How I make this work in the gallery that I have associated with it is if I look at its items property, I'm pointing it to the name of my component, which is tabs, and I'm just doing a dot items to get the items property of my tab component, and it's going to automatically fill that data in to populate my gallery. So I built this here. Now I only have to add this particular component into the different screens on my apps, and then I don't have to worry about manually building all that out. So to add this in, I can go to Insert, Custom, and we see all the components that I have here, tabs being one of them. So that's what I did on all of my screens you're seeing in this app. I've added the tab component, which is what we see right here. And what I did is we see the different properties. So I went into the items property and I put in my information for the screens that I want to go to. And I just copied that into each of my different screens. So again, what this is saving me is I didn't have to come into this screen, add a gallery, add my icon and label and all that, fill in the gallery, and then add this particular rectangle. I just added the component, told it what items to show. That's just one good use case for that. Okay, so what else do we need to do? So we talked a little bit about intuitiveness so far. So what are some things as far as the loading messages and SVGs and visuals that we can do to make our apps more intuitive? Now let's talk about the easy on the eyes part of our pie there. One of the things we want to do is make sure that we're creating a consistent brand. And what I mean by that is we want to make sure that we're matching whatever our company colors are, our typography, and the appropriate images and logo for our company. One of the ways that I do this is I create a branding screen in most of my applications. This screen is meant to be hidden from users. And the whole purpose of it is to take all of our company colors and our fonts and our logos and list that out on the screen so that I have easy access to those to reference them in my app. So this is an example from an app that I have this branding screen in. What I did is I've added rectangle controls and I filled them with our company colors. And I put a label next to that showing the color name and the hex value so that we can use that in our app. Typically, you might have a company brand standard that has this information listed in that you can kind of copy that and put that into your app. Then I did the same thing. I've added in our company logo and then some labels that have our fonts. Now I can easily reference that in my application. Speaking of fonts, a little known thing that we can do in Power Apps is we can actually inject some custom fonts. So let me show you an example of this because it really is just best to kind of walk through that so you can see what I'm talking about. Now look here at this label control for upcoming reservations. If I want to choose what font family to show, I can click on the drop down on the label, or I can click the font here on the right-hand side, and I see this selection of fonts. Now it's not many, so we have Arial, Veranda, all these different ones. So you might think because that's all that shows in the dropdown that those are the only fonts that you can use. Actually, you can use other ones as well. So what I'm going to do here is instead of using this dropdown, I'm going to go up here on the left-hand side, click the dropdown, and we'll select the font property from here. So when I click that, you see that we have that font open sans. What I can do here is if I want to use a different font, I can actually delete that and I can manually type in the name of the font that I want to use. So there's a font called Magneto, And you see, as soon as I type that in, it is pulling the font here into my app. Now, the only word of caution with this is if you're using like custom fonts, you want to make sure that you have a fallback. So while you might have a custom font installed on your computer, you can't know that everyone else using the app will have that font. So what you want to do is have a fallback to a standard web font that everyone has. So I might have Magneto as my primary, but what I can do is I can come here and add a comma, and I can type Arial as my fallback. That way, if someone doesn't have that font loaded, it'll show that other font or backup font. Okay. Now let's talk a bit about performance. So we gave a little bit of tips of how we can make our apps intuitive and easy on the eyes, but we can't neglect performance because if you remember on that pyramid I showed you, making performant apps was kind of the base of the pyramid. So without that, no matter how great looking your app is, if it doesn't function well, if it's not performant, if it isn't relatively fast and functional, people aren't going to use it, which is demonstrated here by this particular study that was done where they were asked people like, what are the most stressful situations that you can think of? Surprisingly, experiencing mobile delays, so on your mobile phone or apps that you're using, was the second most stressful situation that people could think of. So that just shows how important performance is. To understand performance, we have to understand how Power Apps are loaded. First, we have authentication. So Power Apps is part of Office 365, so it has to verify your credentials and make sure that you have the correct licensing and all of that to even use Power Apps. Then it has to get your metadata. So with Power Apps, we can mix and match multiple different data sources in here. And also we have versioning built in the background. So with the metadata retrieval, it's going to have to go and get all of the different data sources you're using in the app, make sure that you can connect to them, and get the latest version populated for you. Then we have to run what's called on-start code. So when the app is initially loaded, we have the ability to define some code right there to do certain things. So it might be pulling information from a database or populating some variables, things like that. And finally, after all that is done, it's finally going to render your screens. And this piece is important because you have to understand how Power Apps handles screen rendering. What it tries to do is to make sure that it's only loading the very first screen or your landing screen. So if I come back to this app in this case, if we look at our tree view, I have all these screens, but our landing screen is whatever screen shows first on this list. So in my case, I have the dashboard screen. So what it's going to try to do in the loading process is only load the elements here on this dashboard screen for me. And then it will load all the other screens as I click to go to them. And this is a good thing because it's going to help your app load faster. We don't want it loading all of these different screens and all the information on them because that would make it very, very slow. And this is the on-start code that I was talking about. So if we click on the app tab, you see a property for on-start. And here's where we can define some formulas. For this particular app, you see I'm doing just a few things. I'm creating a global variable called set current user. That is a very good thing to put in your on-start because oftentimes in apps that you're creating, you might need to get the context of the user running the app. So rather than making several calls to get that information, you can set that once in a variable, and that's going to help your performance there because you can just reference the variable rather than making several calls to get the user context. Now, the key here with the onStart is you want to reduce what you have on here. And I'll kind of go into that a little bit more here. So how can we make our apps performant? Three things that we want to do. We want to reduce, we want to reuse, and we want to recycle. What I mean by that? With reduce, we want to reduce controls. So remember when I talked about how the screens render and it tries to only get the first screen? Well, when you load a screen, it has to load every single control on that screen. So as you can imagine, if your app has a ton of controls, that means the slower it's going to load and run. So ideally, we want to limit the number of controls per screen to under 300 and for the entire app under 500 if possible. This is going to ensure that your Power App loads as fast as it can. That can be kind of hard, especially when building very complex applications. but it is doable. Also, there's certain controls that are more taxing than others. Things like picture, camera, PDF viewer, and video are going to be more taxing controls than, say, a label or text input. So just keep that in mind. As far as reducing, we want to reduce images. Now, I showed you the desk reservation and I had an image at the top. That's a good use of an image, and I just had the one there, but we don't want to overwhelm our application with a ton of images. And if we are using images, we want to make sure that we're optimizing those. So you might go to a website and download a royalty-free image. A lot of those images are in very high quality, meaning that they're also very big. So one of the things you can do is you can use a site like compressor.io and compress that down to the smallest size possible. And there are a few reasons you want to do this. One, not only because it's going to load faster, but two, we have a limit on the total number of images that we can store locally in our Power Apps. So the more images you have that are not compressed, the less images you can actually store. And we want to reduce our data. So remember that metadata retrieval was the second item in our loading process. So even though we have the ability to add almost really an unlimited amount of connectors to different data sources in our app, we really want to keep it limited to, say, under 30 as general guidance there. Otherwise, if you go beyond that, it has to load and connect to all those data sources and authenticate you into that. It's just going to start getting a little bit slow. We also want to limit sequential data operations. And what I mean by that is when we have different formulas in Power Apps, those by default run sequentially. So take this, for example. We want to pull data from 4 different data sources. We have a products list. We'll just say this is in SharePoint. We have a customer list, sales order detail, and sales order header. If we wanted to pull all that information into our application, into a collection, for example, and we had all those formulas listed out to do that, it would take quite a while because each one has to run before the next one can run. So it has to go and pull all the data from my products list. And not until that is done can it go on and pull the data from my customer list and so on and so forth. So you can see the overall time elapsed to do all of that. But thankfully, to help get around that, we have a formula, a function we can use called the concurrent function. What that will do is allow us to transform that, and instead of running that sequentially, we can run those operations in parallel, saving on the total elapsed time. So by wrapping all of these calls in a concurrent, you see that it was able to get all of that data at the same time and greatly reduce the time to load. So that's just a simple trick that we can do to really impact the performance of our applications. Another thing is to consider lookups. So there might be times in the app that you're doing where you need to look up information in a particular data source. Now, a good way to demonstrate this is with this function. Say we have a list of appointments, and I want to get the appointment information. I want to find my appointment that matches my first name and my last name. So to do this, and I want to concatenate that. Now I might do that with a formula like this. I have one lookup to grab my first name because those are stored in separate columns in my data source. And then I'll have another lookup to grab my last name. That's 2 calls I had to make though. That's not really good from a performance standpoint. So what we can do is use the with function instead to make that much cleaner. So we can say with and do a lookup to the appointment list and then do a name dot first name and name dot last name. So that only makes 1 call. Okay, next tip, as far as reducing, we want to reduce hard-coded data thanks to a function called sequence. Now, this is actually something I was doing in a desk reservation app, as you can see here. So you remember how we had that list of times that we could choose from? So we selected the date to reserve it, and then we had times. Well, I didn't have those hard-coded, right? So what I did is I used a formula called with, and I set an interval. I wanted to get the times in 15-minute intervals. So I was able to use sequence to get a sequence of times in those different intervals here to do that for me rather than hard coding all that. So it really is going to help, again, from a time savings perspective of you not having to type all that in, and also from a performance perspective. And there's lots of good documentation and other examples of what you can do with that width formula. Again, we want to reduce scrolling and cross-screen references. Now, what I mean by cross-screen references is in the loading process, it tries to just load that first screen. But if you have dependencies on other screens, that would force it to load those other screens as well on the initial load of your application, really harming performance. So that's called a cross-screen reference. A common scenario of this that you'll see is, say in the store application, I want to click a category to shop for. I want that to take me to another screen where I browse for that category and see the information matching hats. And then I want to click on another screen so I can see, well, what is the information about this hat? So one of the things that we can commonly do that will impact performance is when we build this relationship. So I'm going to go here to category browse. I might make a mistake here and say, instead of what I have here, I might say filter my products. Whoops, not product categories, we want products, where category equals, and then what I might do is on my landing screen, I have a gallery category. So I might say where gallery categories dot selected dot title. So this is actually going to work, and it's going to filter the gallery for me. But what I just did here was I created a screen dependency. In order for this to show the filtered information, it has to pull in all this data from this screen. So now on the onload, it's going to have to load the landing and the category browse screen. The way around that, and you can see how I could do the same thing with the product details. I could do another filter and so on and so forth, causing that screen to have to load. So to get around this, you see instead of that, I had something called filtered products in this items property instead. Well, where is that coming from? What I did is on this gallery where I initially select the category, if we go to the on select property, you see at this point, I'm actually going to add in and do my filter here and put that out into a collection. So I can say, filter my products information where category equals this item, and then take me to the browse screen and pass that data along. Right, so this is really going to help reduce the number of screen dependencies that I have by doing it this way. Screens and code. So another tip, and I do have a video for this on my YouTube, so I know we're running a little bit low on time, so if you want to reference that, you can. Oftentimes when you have forms, you might have one screen where you have the form if you're submitting a new item, and another screen if you're submitting the form for an edit item. So one of the things that we can do is use the same form control, the same screen for both instances. Also, we want to recycle. So this is where those components come into play. Again, instead of reinventing the wheel and creating a header or a footer or a gallery, whatever it might be, that's the same on multiple different screens, put that in as a component, and that will help reduce and recycle the number of controls you have. Okay, so I wanted to make sure that I left you with a ton of resources here. So a few things here. That's a link to the Power Users Community app samples. That's where you can go to get that inspiration I talked about. There's also a great link for component samples. So if you want to learn more about components and what you can do there, that's a link that can get you there. If you want to use GIFs for loading messages and SVGs like I demoed there in the app, a good site that I like for that is loading.io. The Power Users Video Gallery is another great way. People make a lot of videos showing apps they created to get ideas there. We talked about accessibility and how important that is. So a few key things to help make sure your apps are accessible. One, we have an accessibility checker built in, but there's also two websites, a contrast and a color blindness simulator, that are really good to help make sure that you're optimizing your apps for that scenario. That's a site that I like for background images. Pexels is really good. The image compressor site, and then these are all the links to my GitHub, YouTube, and my blog. Real quick, I think we have a few more minutes and I don't see any things in the chat quite yet. So I did want to touch on the accessibility aspect because I think that is really important. So if we come here into a Power App that we have, we see this little horseshoe icon. And we have all the different app checkers. So one of the ones is accessibility. So this is what's going to help you make sure that you're optimizing your app. So I can see, for example, it's going to highlight things like, do you have an accessible label? So I can click on this and I can see that I don't have a label for this cancel icon. So I can simply go in, it takes me right to that and put a message there so that when people are using screen readers and things like that, they'll be able to know what that particular button does. So it's really simple and easy to use and tells you everything that you need to know from a particular usability standpoint. It looks like, I think we did have a question in there. Let's see, so someone's asking, what is the best approach for Canvas apps? Try to make everything in one screen, or would it be okay to spread the app experience into multiple screens? Great question. So if you noticed everything that I did here, I didn't try to do everything in one screen. And that's really across every app that I have. So this particular app, I have one screen for a dashboard. I have one for appointments, one for selecting the date, one for selecting the desk and confirm and success. That to me is a much better approach for many reasons. One, performance, because again, if you try to do everything on that one screen that loads, it's going to take forever to run. Another, for usability, you want to reduce the amount of stuff that you have on a given screen. And another, I think it'll be much easier to maintain, not having to scroll through a screen in a giant form for that. And you'll see that I have that same concept in almost every app I built. I like to really separate things out in forms over multiple screens, which is what I'm doing here as well, as far as seeing the timesheet information and the new timesheets. This is another cool tip to show is just how we can greatly format our galleries. So this timesheet kind of looks like, something similar to QuickBooks for entering time, but it's just a gallery that I have here formatted with some special formatting. And I can even have a repeating gallery here, which I do have a video about as well. So yes, to answer your question, I would definitely encourage you to split things out into separate screens if that makes sense. Let's see. Another question here. How did you get the round corner rectangles? Great question. So let's see what I'll show here. Let's go back to this. So first of all, this right here is just a circle, but if we want to have a rounded corners rectangle, let me just add a new screen and show you the property for that. So I'm going to insert, I think for that, I was actually using a button, right? And we have a property with that called border radius. So right now it's set to 10, but if I change that radius to say 0, it's very square. But then I can go back in and make it even more round, say change it to 60, and you can see it's even more rounded. So we have that property there with the button controls that I was doing. If you wanted to not have a button and just have like a rectangle control, that's where I was using that HTML input I was talking about. So if I go to inputs, if we go to text, there's an HTML text, and this is where I can have way more ability to customize this. I can hard code in some HTML to have like a rounded rectangle or custom shapes that I want here. Someone asked, can I explain how to do the tabs on one screen? Let me see the best way to show that. Where did I have that here? Just one moment, let me navigate to the right place. Here we go. So for this, I think this is what you're probably referring to, where I have, this is the same screen, but I had upcoming and previous. So how I handled this is if we look at below, this right here is a gallery that just shows the reservations that I have. So here, I really just hard coded 2 rectangles. So I went to insert icon rectangle, and I put those below each of these labels. So I have a label for previous and I have a label for upcoming. So really all I did, very simple, I put those 2 labels there, and when I click on the on select of one of these labels, so I'm going to go to the previous or the upcoming one, I'm doing the same thing I did for the tab at the bottom. I'm just using an update context. So I'm saying, is this selected, yes or no, and I'm toggling the value. And then based off of that, I'm going to filter my gallery. So in the gallery, if I go to the items, you see I have two different galleries. I have upcoming and I have past. So for the upcoming, the visible is set to the upcoming selected. And for the gallery, past, the visible is set to the previous, so past selected variable. So that's all I'm doing. I click on a label, I'm setting the upcoming variable to true, and I'm setting the previous to false, and so on and so forth. Man, cool, lots of questions here. Oh, okay, sorry, you clarified on the rounded corners thing. So my appointments, yes. So this right here, this is that HTML control. So this section that you're seeing here. So this is just a little simple line of HTML. It's a div with a gray border and a radius of 10% that I've used to get that effect. So again, I'm practicing what I preach here and using that HTML control for that. Yeah, so many questions. Good thing, trying to
I
keep up with
know.
them.
The questions are flying in, April, which is absolutely great. There was one you just missed a little bit earlier. There was people looking for your YouTube channel again, just so they can follow more demo videos. Are you able to jump into your slide just to show the location of that?
Yes, thank you. Okay, so yeah, it's right there. So it's just youtube.com /C/April Dunham. And a lot of the stuff that I showed today, I do have videos on. So I have one on how to do multi-screens forms, so moving between those. I have the tabs concept, HTML control. So all the stuff, if you need to reference that later on, those are all videos on my channel.
Super. We have a few more minutes. I might just jump back in there to the questions then. So there's a question there. Are these apps developed considering accessibility?
Yes, now as you can see on like some of these are a work in progress. So you might have noticed in the accessibility checker of this one, for example, I did have 43 errors. And that's just because I'm constantly tweaking these. So I'm adding in different labels and I just haven't got around to building that. But yes, I'm always considering accessibility in mind and making sure I have labels and tab stops and focus showing there.
Okay, and then there was another question just there. Is it possible to embed components in galleries?
Not right now. I think that's something that I'm hoping will come down the line, but right now we can't have those embedded inside galleries. We can have galleries in components, but not components in galleries.
Brilliant. That seems to be all the questions are in so far, April. I just want to say thank you on behalf of the ESPC community for taking the time today to complete this webinar. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. And just one more thing to add too. So this desk reservation, the timesheet, I have a calendar component as well. I do have videos on my YouTube with links to my GitHub. So if you go to my GitHub, I actually have all of these as downloadable files. So if you wanted to use these applications, they're out there for free to download and install as well.
And April, you might just go back to your contact details slide. You had a slide there where people can follow you in various different things.
Yeah, so that's the GitHub link there. So just
Great.
go to github.com /April Dunham, and there's a Power Apps section there with all these samples.
Brilliant. And for everybody else, there has been quite a few requests in for the recording of this webinar. The answer is yes, it is being recorded and it will be shared with you as soon as it is available. April, thank you so much for taking the time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I had fun.
Brilliant stuff. April, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us today. Don't forget that the ESPC 21 online will take place on the 1st and 2nd of June 2021. To be a part of this event, simply register today for free. We also just announced our keynote and full details are available at sharepointeurope.com. That is the end of today's webinar. A big thank you to April Dunham for joining us today, and thank you. Take care and goodbye.